There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They don't announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They slip in quietly, wearing the clothes of a Tuesday night, or the soft hum of a refrigerator in a sleeping apartment. You don't recognize them as turning points until long after they've passed, when you look back and see the delicate, indelible line they drew in the sand of your own history. For me, that moment smelled like old books and Julian's shampoo, and it felt like the terrifying, beautiful weight of him sleeping on my chest. It was a moment that held the entire world, a fragile globe of glass I was afraid to breathe on, for fear it might shatter into a million pieces of what we used to be. It began, as so many of these quiet revolutions do, on my couch. The piece of furniture itself was unremarkable, a deep gray sectional I'd bought secondhand, softened by years of use before it ever came to me. It had become the geography of our friendship, the silent witness to countless movies, late-night conversations, and shared pizzas. But on this particular night, the landscape had shifted. The familiar territory felt alien, charged with a new and volatile atmosphere. We had been watching some mindless action film, the kind Julian loved and I tolerated, its explosions and gunfire a distant, percussive backdrop to the symphony of anxiety playing in my own head. He had been quiet for a while, his usual running commentary on plot holes and bad special effects tapering off into silence. I had assumed he was just absorbed, but when I glanced over, his head had tipped back against the cushions, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and even. He was asleep. This, in itself, was not unusual. Julian ran on a constant, low-grade fuel of caffeine and nervous energy. His crashes were as sudden and complete as a power outage. What was different was what happened next. In his sleep, he shifted, a slow, unconscious migration across the space that separated us. It was a journey of inches, a languid drift guided by some unseen current of exhaustion or comfort. He slumped sideways, his head coming to rest on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. It was as if a live wire had been laid against my skin, sending a current of pure, unadulterated panic through every nerve. I held my breath, my own lungs suddenly feeling like foreign objects in my chest. I could feel the warmth of him through the thin fabric of my t-shirt, the soft tickle of his hair against my neck. Every point of contact was a supernova of sensation, a detailed map of proximity that my mind began to chart with painstaking, agonizing precision. He sighed in his sleep, a soft, unguarded sound that seemed to dismantle my defenses piece by piece. His body relaxed further, and he slid down until his head was resting not on my shoulder, but squarely on my chest, his arm draped loosely across my stomach. And there we were. He was a warm, breathing weight against me, a solid and undeniable presence in the landscape of my carefully constructed solitude. The movie played on, its flickering light dancing across the walls of my small living room, illuminating the dust motes that drifted in the still air. I felt like one of them, suspended and weightless, caught in a beam of impossible light. I could feel the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest with every breath he took, a steady, hypnotic tempo that seemed to be gradually coaxing my own frantic heartbeat into a slower, more manageable rhythm. This was the precipice. I knew it with a certainty that was as terrifying as it was absolute. I could gently push him away, guide him back to his side of the couch, and the moment would evaporate, becoming nothing more than an anomaly, a footnote in the history of our friendship. The boundary would be restored. Or I could do nothing. I could stay perfectly still, let him sleep, and in my stillness, acknowledge that the boundary had already dissolved into mist. I chose to do nothing. I sat there in the blue-gray light of the television, a living statue with a sleeping man on his chest, and felt the tectonic plates of my world begin to shift. It was a dangerous choice, a gamble with the most precious thing I had. Our friendship was a quiet, sturdy structure we had built together over years, a shelter from the storms of our respective lives. And in that moment, I feared I was turning it into a house of cards, so fragile that a single, honest breath could bring it all tumbling down. But beneath the fear, a deeper, more treacherous feeling was taking root, a profound, aching tenderness that I had spent years trying to bury. Watching him sleep, his face softened and free of the tension he usually carried in his jaw, I felt a wave of affection so powerful it almost stole the air from my lungs. He was the quiet one everyone missed, or rather, the one whose quietness they misinterpreted. They saw the easy smile, the confident way he moved through the world, and they missed the subtle shadows of loneliness in his eyes, the slight hesitation before he spoke, the way he held himself just a little too still when he thought no one was looking. But I noticed everything. And that had always been my secret, my burden, and my most cherished privilege. To understand the weight of that moment on the couch, you have to understand the foundation it was built upon. Julian and I met in our first year of university, two solitary ships passing in the crowded, noisy waters of collegiate life. We were both on the rowing team, a sport that suited our shared preference for quiet intensity and rhythmic, repetitive work over the chaotic clamor of other team sports. I was a photographer even then, my camera a shield that allowed me to observe the world from a safe distance. I was documenting the team for a project, capturing the grimaces of effort, the sheen of sweat on skin, the stark, beautiful geometry of oars slicing through the water at dawn. I saw him through my lens before I ever truly spoke to him. He was physically impressive, of course. Rowing sculpts a person into a study of lean muscle and controlled power. But what my camera captured, and what drew me in, was the stillness in him. In the boisterous, back-slapping world of the team, he possessed a core of quiet introspection. He could laugh and joke with the others, but I would often catch him looking out over the water, his expression distant, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. He was a puzzle of contrasts, an extrovert's shell built around an introvert's heart. Our friendship didn't begin with a grand conversation or a shared moment of triumph. It began with a shared silence. We were often the first to arrive at the boathouse for early morning practice, moving through the pre-dawn chill in a comfortable quiet, preparing our shells, the only sounds the gentle lapping of water against the dock and the squeak of oarlocks. We learned the rhythm of each other's presence before we ever learned the details of each other's lives. I learned that he hummed, a low, tuneless sound, when he was concentrating. He learned that I had a habit of tracing the grain of the wooden or handle with my thumb. We built our connection out of these small, unspoken observations, a language of gesture and habit that felt more intimate than any conversation. The first time we truly talked, it was about my photographs. He'd seen me with my camera slung over my shoulder at all hours, and finally, one afternoon, while we were stretching on the dock, he asked to see them. I was hesitant. My photography was, and still is, deeply personal. It's how I process the world, how I make sense of the things I can't put into words. Showing someone my photos felt like letting them read my diary. But there was a genuine curiosity in his eyes, a gentle inquiry that lacked the usual performative interest I was used to. So I pulled out my portfolio on my laptop, my hands feeling clumsy and my heart thudding with a nervous rhythm. He sat beside me on the worn wooden planks of the dock, our shoulders almost touching, and scrolled through the images in silence. He didn't just look at them, he saw them. He didn't comment on the technical aspects, the f-stops or shutter speeds. He commented on the feeling. He pointed to a photo of an empty shell, moored at the dock in the fog, its long, elegant lines disappearing into the gray mist. "This one feels lonely," he said, his voice quiet. "But it's a peaceful kind of lonely. Like it's okay to be alone." He stopped on another, a close-up of a teammate's hands, raw and blistered, gripping an oar. "You can feel how much this costs," he murmured. "Not just the pain, but the work, the dedication." He saw what I was trying to say without me having to say a word. He understood the emotional language of my images. It felt like he had reached into my chest and gently touched something no one else had ever known was there. In that moment, something shifted inside me. It was a subtle realignment, the click of a lock finding its key. It was the beginning of my quiet, hopeless, and deeply cherished love for him. Our friendship solidified from there, growing into the kind of easy, essential bond that feels both miraculous and inevitable. We were a study in complementary opposites. He was the one who would drag me out of my apartment, insisting that human interaction was, in fact, necessary for survival. I was the one who provided the quiet space where he could finally stop performing, where he could let the mask of easy confidence fall away and just be. He was studying software engineering, a world of clean logic and binary code that fascinated and baffled me. I was studying fine art, a world of subjectivity and emotion that he seemed to respect with a kind of gentle awe. We were the anchors in each other's lives, the fixed points in a world that often felt chaotic and uncertain. My feelings for him became a room inside my heart that I kept locked. It was a space I visited privately, where I could replay the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, or the sound of his laugh, or the casual way he would sometimes lean against my arm when looking at something on my computer screen. I furnished this room with 1,000 tiny details: the scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the way he always ordered the same thing at our favorite diner, the worn-out gray sweatshirt he wore whenever he was feeling down. It was a secret, and the keeping of it became a part of who I was. I was terrified of what would happen if the door to that room ever swung open. The potential loss was too great to even contemplate. The friendship we had was too precious, too vital. So I became a master of emotional architecture, building walls and reinforcing boundaries, ensuring that nothing I felt would ever spill out and ruin the beautiful, fragile thing we had. He dated, of course. There was a string of women who were all perfectly nice, and whom I treated with a polite, friendly distance that was my own form of self-preservation. His longest relationship was with Sarah, a bright, bubbly law student he met in our final year of university. They were together for nearly 3 years, and for those 3 years, I learned to compartmentalize my feelings with an almost surgical precision. I was his best friend. I listened to his relationship woes, offered advice, and celebrated their anniversaries with them. I watched him love someone else, and I learned to live with the quiet, persistent ache it produced in my chest. It was a dull pain, a background radiation that I grew so accustomed to, I barely noticed it anymore. I told myself that his happiness was all that mattered, and for the most part, I even believed it. Our friendship remained the constant, the bedrock. Even when he was with Sarah, he still needed my quiet space. He would come over after a stressful day, and we would just exist in the same room, him coding on his laptop, me editing photos, the comfortable silence a balm for both of us. The structure we had built was strong enough to withstand the presence of others in our lives. Or so I thought. The shift, when it came, was not a gradual erosion but a sudden, seismic event. It was the phone call I received late on a Wednesday night. It was Julian, his voice thick and broken in a way I had never heard before. He could barely get the words out. Sarah had ended it. She was moving to another city for a job, and she didn't see a future for them long distance. It wasn't a fight, not a dramatic explosion, just a quiet, sensible, and utterly devastating conclusion. He sounded hollowed out, a building whose foundations had been swept away. Can I come over?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a question. It was a plea. When I opened my door, he looked like a ghost. The usual light in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dull, vacant exhaustion. He walked in without a word and collapsed onto my couch, the same couch that would later become our silent battleground. He didn't cry, not at first. He just sat there, staring at the blank television screen, his hands clenched in his lap. I made him tea, the way my mother used to for me when I was sick, and sat on the armchair opposite him, giving him the space he seemed to need. For hours, he said nothing. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with unspoken pain. I just sat with him, a silent sentinel, letting my presence be my only offering of comfort. I knew he wasn't ready for words, for platitudes, or advice. He just needed not to be alone in his own empty apartment, a space that was suddenly haunted by the ghost of a shared life. Finally, well after midnight, he started to talk. The words came out in a torrent, a jumble of grief and confusion and self-recrimination. He talked about their plans, the future they had mapped out, the little inside jokes that were now meaningless artifacts of a dead language. He dissected every conversation from the past few months, searching for clues he had missed, For the moment, it had all started to unravel. I just listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't offer easy answers. I just let him pour all of it out into the safe, quiet space of my living room. When he finally ran out of words, he slumped back, looking utterly drained. His eyes were red-rimmed, and the first tears finally tracked their way through the stubble on his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. He just let them fall. I don't know how to be alone, he whispered, and the confession was so raw, so vulnerable, it felt like a physical blow. It was the first time I had ever seen the armor of his self-sufficiency crack. He stayed that night, sleeping on the couch while I took the floor, not wanting to leave him completely alone. That was the beginning of the change. His apartment became a place he avoided, a museum of a failed relationship. My apartment, my quiet sanctuary, became his refuge. He started spending most of his evenings with me. It began under the guise of needing company, of not wanting to face the silence of his own place. We'd order takeout, watch movies, or just work in companionable silence. It felt like an extension of our old friendship, just amplified by his current need. But then, a new pattern began to emerge, a ritual that would come to define the strange, liminal space we now inhabited. The ritual began with exhaustion. It was always couched in practicality. He'd be working late on a project, his laptop balanced on his knees as he sat on my couch, the lines of code a complex tapestry on the screen. He would yawn, rub his eyes, and say something like, "Man, I'm wrecked. I don't think I have the energy to drive home." The first time he said it, I offered him the couch without a second thought. It was the natural, friendly thing to do. He accepted gratefully, and I gave him a spare blanket and pillow. But it kept happening. The excuses were always plausible. An early meeting near my place, a late night at the office, the simple, weary admission of being too tired to move. The couch became his semi-permanent bed. Then, one night, the ritual evolved. We had stayed up late talking, a long, meandering conversation about everything and nothing. When we finally decided to call it a night, he stood up and stretched, a pained look on his face. "My back is killing me from this couch," he said, half joking. There was a pause, a small, significant pocket of silence. My heart started beating a little faster. I knew what was coming, or at least, I hoped and feared I knew. "Hey, this is going to sound weird," he started, running a hand through his already messy hair, a telltale sign of his anxiety. "But, would it be okay if I just crashed in your bed? I promise I'll stay on my side. It's just, I really need a decent night's sleep." The air in the room seemed to thin, to become electric. This was a new threshold, a door I had never imagined us opening. My bed was my most private space, the one place that was unequivocally mine. Sharing it felt like a profound act of intimacy, far more so than a couch. My mind raced, a frantic catalog of all the reasons this was a terrible, dangerous, monumentally stupid idea. It would blur the lines irrevocably. It would feed the secret hope I was trying so hard to starve. It would make the mornings unbearable, waking up next to him, knowing he was only there for comfort, not for me. But when I looked at him, all I saw was the deep, bone-weary exhaustion in his eyes. I saw my friend, who was hurting and lost, and just wanted a comfortable place to rest. How could I say no? "Yeah," I heard myself say, my voice sounding unnaturally calm. "Yeah, of course. It's fine." That first night was torture. I lay on my side of the queen-sized bed, my body ramrod straight, my muscles coiled like tight springs. I was hyper-aware of everything. The subtle dip in the mattress from his weight. The sound of his breathing, deeper and more even than my own shallow, ragged breaths. The scent of his soap, a clean, fresh smell that seemed to fill the entire room. I felt like I was lying next to a sleeping star, a body of immense heat and gravity that I was desperately trying not to be pulled into. I didn't sleep at all. I just lay there in the darkness, listening, feeling, and trying to quiet the riot in my own chest. When my alarm went off in the morning, I pretended to be asleep until I heard him get up and the bathroom door click shut. I couldn't face the morning, the casual, friendly thanks, man, that I knew would come. A phrase that would underscore the platonic nature of the arrangement and make my own internal turmoil feel all the more foolish. But he didn't leave. When I finally emerged from my room, he was in my kitchen, making coffee. He smiled at me, a sleepy, genuine smile that made my stomach do a slow, painful flip. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Figured you'd want some of this." He handed me a mug, his fingers brushing against mine. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through me. We drank our coffee in a comfortable silence that felt both achingly familiar and terrifyingly new. This was different. This was domestic. This was a scene from a life I had only ever allowed myself to imagine in the most secret corners of my mind. And so, the ritual solidified into a new normal. Most nights, Julian would end up at my apartment. Most nights, he would end up in my bed. The excuse of his bad back was used a few more times, and then it was dispensed with altogether. It became the unspoken assumption. We'd finish watching a movie, and he would simply stand up and say, "Well, I'm heading to bed," and walk into my bedroom as if it were his own. The first few times, the tension was a palpable thing, a third presence in the room. I would lie on my designated side, creating a demilitarized zone of empty sheets between us. But as the nights turned into weeks, the space began to shrink. The change was gradual, a slow, geological process of continental drift. It started with an accidental brush of his foot against mine in the night. Then, one morning, I woke up to find his hand resting on the pillow near my head. The true turning point in the ritual came on a cold, rainy night about a month into this new arrangement. A storm was raging outside, the wind rattling the window panes of my old apartment building. The sound usually made me feel cozy, safe in my small haven. But that night, it just seemed to amplify the storm inside me. Julian had been quiet all evening, lost in his own thoughts. He seemed more fragile than usual, the shadows under his eyes deeper. When we went to bed, the distance between us felt more pronounced, like a vast, cold ocean. I lay there, listening to the rain and the frantic beating of my own heart. When he spoke, his voice soft in the darkness. "Leo," he said, "are you awake?" "Yeah," I whispered back, my throat suddenly dry. There was a long pause. I could hear him shift, the rustle of the duvet a loud sound in the quiet room. I'm really cold," he said, and his voice was so small, so vulnerable. It wasn't a statement about the temperature of the room. It was a confession. It was an admission of a deeper, more profound chill. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, what he was asking for. This was another choice, another door. I could offer him another blanket. I could get up and turn up the heat. Or I could close the distance. I could cross the empty space between us. I took a breath, and I rolled onto my side to face him. In the dim light filtering in from the street lamp outside, I could just make out the shape of him, a huddled form under the covers. I reached out an arm, a hesitant, questioning gesture. He met me halfway. He moved into my space, his body fitting against mine, his head finding the hollow of my shoulder. He was trembling, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him closer, tucking the duvet around us both. His own arm came up to rest on my chest, his hand loosely curled over my heart. He sighed, a long, shuddering breath, and the tension seemed to bleed out of him. He felt like a ship that had finally found its harbor after a long and brutal storm. And I held him. I just held him, my chin resting on the top of his head, breathing in the scent of his hair. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by a feeling so vast and overwhelming it had no name. It was more than tenderness, more than affection. It was the profound, elemental rightness of holding him, of offering him this small sanctuary of warmth and stillness. He fell asleep like that, his breathing evening out, his body growing heavy and relaxed in my arms. I stayed awake for a long time, listening to the rain, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my ribs, and wondering how I was ever going to survive this. This became the new apex of our ritual, the cuddling. It didn't happen every night, but it happened often enough to become a new, unspoken language. There was never a discussion about it. It would just happen. One of us would shift in the night, and the other would respond, and soon we would be tangled together, a mess of limbs and shared warmth. It existed in a strange bubble of plausible deniability. In the darkness, under the cover of sleepiness and cold, it could be explained away as a simple, instinctual search for comfort. But in the stark light of morning, we would untangle ourselves before we were fully awake, retreating to our respective sides of the bed, never acknowledging what had passed between us in the night. We would get up, make coffee, and talk about our plans for the day as if nothing had happened. It was a delicate, dangerous dance of intimacy and avoidance. For me, it was a slow, exquisite form of torture. My locked room of feelings was no longer locked. The door had been thrown wide open, and everything I had kept hidden was now spilling out into the daylight, even if only I could see it. Every night was a battle between the overwhelming joy of holding him and the crushing anxiety of what it all meant. Was this just a manifestation of his grief? Was I just a convenient, warm body, a placeholder for the intimacy he had lost? The questions circled in my mind relentlessly. I would lie there, his head on my chest, my fingers tracing patterns on his back, and I would feel like a fraud. I was taking a comfort that was freely given, but I was imbuing it with a meaning that he almost certainly did not intend. I was a thief, stealing moments of intimacy under false pretenses, and the guilt was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Yet, I couldn't stop it. I was too weak, too selfish. The feeling of him sleeping in my arms was a powerful, addictive drug. It was the quiet affirmation of a connection I had craved for years. It was the physical manifestation of the role I had always played in his life, his safe harbor. And so I let it continue, living this strange double life. By day, we were best friends, our interactions a model of platonic ease. By night, we were two bodies seeking solace in each other's arms, our relationship a question mark written in the darkness. I lived for the nights and dreaded the mornings. I was a photographer obsessed with a single image, studying every detail, every nuance of light and shadow, trying to decipher its true meaning, terrified that in the end, it was just a beautiful, meaningless abstraction. I was developing a photograph in a darkroom, watching the image of us slowly emerge, holding my breath, praying it wouldn't be overexposed and ruined by the harsh light of reality. The crossing happened on a Sunday. It was a lazy, quiet day, one of those rare days with no obligations, no plans. We had spent the afternoon in comfortable silence, me editing a recent shoot, him reading a book on the other end of the couch. The air was soft with the late afternoon sun slanting through the windows. It felt peaceful, domestic, the kind of day that felt like a glimpse into a possible future, a future that was both beautiful and impossibly out of reach. As evening fell, we ordered a pizza and put on a movie, falling back into our familiar routine. But something felt different. The usual easy silence between us was stretched thin, taut, with an unspoken tension. I was acutely aware of him next to me, of the small space of gray couch cushion that separated us. The movie ended, the credits rolling in silence. Neither of us moved to turn it off. The only light in the room was the cool blue glow of the screen, casting long shadows on the walls. Julian turned his head to look at me. His expression was unreadable in the dim light, but his eyes were dark and serious. My heart began to pound, a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. I had a premonition, a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty that the fragile bubble we had been living in was about to burst. "Leo," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. It was the same way he had spoken my name in the dark on that first rainy night. "Yeah," I managed to say, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at me, his gaze so intense it felt like he was seeing past my skin, past my bones, and directly into the frantic, terrified heart of me. He was mapping the geography of my face, his eyes tracing my brow, my nose, my mouth. The silence stretched on, filled with the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. I felt pinned by his gaze, unable to look away, unable to breathe. "Can I ask you something?" he finally said, his voice low and laced with an emotion I couldn't identify. It sounded like fear. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. He took a breath, a small, shaky thing. He shifted slightly, closing the small gap between us on the couch. His knee brushed against mine, and the contact was electric, a spark in the charged air. He never broke eye contact. "This is going to sound crazy," he began, then stopped, as if searching for the right words, the right key to unlock the thing he wanted to say. He started again. "All this time, staying here, with you." He gestured vaguely to the room around us, to the life we had been living for the past few months. It's the only thing that's felt real. The only thing that's made sense." My mind was reeling. I couldn't process what he was saying. I was bracing myself for the end, for the "I think I need to move on" speech, for the gentle but firm restoration of our old boundaries. But that's not what he said. He reached out, his hand hesitant, and gently touched my face. His fingers were warm against my cheek, his thumb stroking softly along my jawline. It was the most deliberate, unambiguous touch that had ever passed between us. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't for comfort in the dark. It was a question. "Leo," he whispered, his voice thick with a vulnerability that mirrored my own. "Would it be okay?" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I knew what he was asking. The world seemed to slow down, to narrow to this single point in time, to the space between his lips and mine. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach. The fear of what this would mean, of the potential for ruin, of the catastrophic heartbreak that could follow. But beneath the fear was a current of pure, undiluted longing, a tide that had been pulling at me for years. It was the hope I had tried to kill, rising up, fierce and undeniable. I had a choice. I could pull back. I could make a joke, deflect, and pretend I didn't understand. I could save our friendship. Or I could risk everything for the possibility of something more. I leaned in. The kiss was not what I had expected. It wasn't passionate or demanding. It was tentative, soft, and breathtakingly gentle. It was a question, a confession, and an apology all at once. It was the taste of salt and uncertainty, the feeling of coming home to a place I had never been. His lips were soft against mine, a hesitant pressure that asked for nothing more than it was given. I brought my hand up to his neck, my fingers tangling in the soft hair at his nape, and the simple act of touching him so deliberately, so openly, felt like a revolution. It was a quiet, desperate, and profoundly honest conversation without words. It was the culmination of 1,000 unspoken moments, of every late-night talk, every shared silence, every night spent holding him in the dark. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. We rested our foreheads together, the glow of the television screen painting us in shades of blue and gray. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before. It wasn't empty. It was full. It was vibrating with the aftershock of what had just happened. The line had been crossed. The house of cards was still standing, and I had no idea what to do next. The aftermath was a landscape of profound and terrifying silence. The morning after the kiss was not like the other mornings. The easy domesticity was gone, replaced by a fragile, brittle tension. I woke up first, alone in my bed. The space beside me was cool, the sheets rumpled and empty. I heard the sound of the front door closing softly. He was gone. He had left without a word, without a note, without a single glance back. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, seeped into my bones. I had misinterpreted everything. The kiss had been a mistake, a moment of grief-fueled confusion on his part that he now deeply regretted. I had been a fool to lean in, a fool to let my own desperate hope override my common sense. The beautiful, fragile thing we had built was not just ruined. It was obliterated, and the smoking crater was my own fault. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. The silence from him was absolute. My texts went unanswered, my calls went straight to voicemail. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth, or at least from the landscape of my life. My apartment, which had been his refuge, now felt like a tomb. It was too quiet, too empty. Every corner of it seemed to hold a ghost of him. The indent on the couch cushion where he always sat. The extra mug by the coffee maker. The scent of his shampoo that still lingered on my pillowcase. I was adrift in a sea of his absence, and the silence was a constant, deafening roar. My carefully guarded heart, which I had so recklessly offered up, felt like it had been shattered into a million tiny pieces. The pain was a physical thing, a dull, heavy ache in the center of my chest that made it difficult to breathe. After a week of this agonizing silence, something inside me shifted. The grief and self-pity began to curdle into a slow-burning anger. An anger at him for his cowardice, for running away without a single word of explanation. But more than that, an anger at myself. I had spent years being the quiet observer, the passive documentarian of my own life, too afraid to be an active participant. I had let him set the terms of our entire relationship, from the friendship to the ambiguous intimacy of our nights together. I had waited and hoped and analyzed every gesture from the safety of my own head, but I had never demanded anything. I had never asked for clarity. I had made myself so small, so accommodating, that I had become complicit in my own heartbreak. I realized that if I wanted an answer, if I wanted any kind of closure, I couldn't wait for him to give it to me. I had to go and get it myself. I drove to his apartment that evening, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, a mixture of terror and resolve fueling my every move. I had no idea what I was going to say, no script, no plan. I just knew that the silence had to end, one way or another. I stood outside his apartment door for a long time, my hand hovering over the doorbell. This was it, the point of no return. I finally pressed the button, the chime echoing in the quiet hallway, a sound that felt like a gunshot in the tense silence. He opened the door. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same worn-out gray sweatshirt he always wore when he was down, and his eyes were shadowed, his face pale and unshaven. He looked as haunted as I felt. When he saw me, his expression was a complex mixture of shock, guilt, and something that looked heartbreakingly like relief. He didn't say anything, just stood there, blocking the doorway. "Are you going to let me in?" I asked, my voice coming out stronger and steadier than I expected. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped back, opening the door wider. I walked into his apartment. It was neat, almost sterile, but it felt cold and unlived in compared to the cluttered warmth of my own place. It was the home of a man who was just passing through, not a place where a life was being built. I turned to face him, my arms crossed over my chest, a defensive posture I didn't even realize I had taken. "A week, Julian," I said, my voice low and tight. "An entire week of nothing. You kiss me, and then you disappear. You owe me an explanation." I think I've earned at least that much. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at a spot on the floor, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his sweatshirt. "I know," he said, his voice rough. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Leo. I'm a coward. Sorry isn't an explanation," I said, the anger rising in me, hot and sharp. What was it, Julian? What was any of it? The nights in my bed? The kiss? Was I just a convenient distraction? A stand-in until you felt better? Because if that's all it was, you need to tell me. You need to look me in the eye and tell me that it meant nothing. He finally looked up, and his eyes were shining with unshed tears. The sight of it almost broke my resolve, but I held my ground. I needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "God, no. It wasn't nothing. It was everything. That's the problem." He sank down onto his own couch, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with a silent, racking sob. I stood there, frozen, the anger draining out of me, replaced by a wave of confusion and a deep, familiar ache of empathy. I went and sat beside him, leaving a careful space between us. I waited. After a long time, he finally lifted his head, his face streaked with tears. "I didn't know what I was doing," he said, his voice ragged. "When Sarah left, my whole world just fell apart. Everything I thought I knew, everything I thought I wanted, it was just gone. And you were the only solid thing left. Your apartment was the only place I felt safe. You were the only person I could stand to be around." He took a shaky breath. "At first, that's all it was. It was just comfort. You're my best friend. It felt safe to be near you. But then, it started to change. I don't even know when. lying next to you at night. It stopped being about not being alone. It started being about being with you. He looked at me then, his gaze direct and filled with a desperate, pleading honesty. I started to rely on it, Leo. On you. On your warmth. On the sound of your breathing. I'd lie there, awake, just listening to you sleep, and I would feel peaceful. A kind of peace I haven't felt in years, maybe ever. And it terrified me, because I didn't understand it. It didn't fit into any of the boxes I have in my head for how life is supposed to work. I love you, Leo. I think I've loved you for a long time, but I called it friendship because that was easier. It was safer. I didn't know how to see it as anything else. The confession hung in the air between us, fragile and luminous. He loved me. He had said the words. Words I had never, ever expected to hear. That night, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, when I kissed you, it wasn't a mistake. It was the most honest thing I've done in my entire life. And it felt right. It felt so right that it scared the hell out of me. Because the moment it was over, all my fear came rushing back in. What if I was wrong? What if I was just confusing grief and loneliness with something else? What if I ruined the most important relationship in my life because I couldn't figure out my own head? So I ran. I ran because I was afraid of hurting you. And I was afraid of what this meant for me. For who I thought I was. He finally ran out of words. His confession laid bare between us. He looked exhausted, but also lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. I looked at him, at this man I had known and loved for years, this beautiful, confused, and wonderfully human person, and I felt the last of my anger dissolve, leaving only a profound, bone-deep tenderness in its place. He hadn't been cruel. He had just been lost. We both had been. I closed the small gap between us on the couch. I reached out and took his hand, my fingers lacing through his. His hand was cold, but it gripped mine with a surprising strength. You're an idiot, I said softly. A small, watery smile touched his lips. I know, you should have just talked to me. I continued, my thumb stroking the back of his hand. All this time, you were trying to figure it out on your own, and I was right here. We could have figured it out together, I know, he said again, his voice full of regret. I'm not used to to talking about feelings. I'm used to fixing things, to finding logical solutions. And there's nothing logical about this. It just is. He squeezed my hand. Is it too late? Did I break it? Us. I looked at our joined hands, at the way our fingers fit together so perfectly. I thought about the locked room inside my heart, and how for the first time, it felt like someone else was standing in it with me, not as a visitor, but as a resident. No, I said, and the word felt like an anchor, solid and true. You didn't break it. You just made a mess. But we can clean it up. The resolution did not come with a bolt of lightning or a grand, cinematic declaration. It arrived quietly, in the same way our love had grown, in the small, unassuming moments. After our conversation, after all the fear and confusion had been laid bare, a new kind of silence settled between us. It was not the tense, brittle silence of the past week, nor the ambiguous, charged silence of the months before. It was a calm, foundational silence. The silence of understanding. The silence of two people who had finally found their way to the same page, in the same book. We stayed on his couch for a long time, not talking, just holding hands, letting the truth of it all settle around us. It felt like the quiet moment after a storm has passed, when the air is clean and fresh, and the world feels new. That night, I didn't go back to my apartment. I stayed with him. But this time, it was different. When we went to bed, there was no pretext of comfort or exhaustion. There was no demilitarized zone of sheets between us. He turned to me in the darkness and pulled me into his arms, and I went willingly, sinking into his embrace as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He kissed me again, and this time, there was no hesitation, no fear. It was a kiss of confirmation, of quiet certainty. It was a promise. We fell asleep tangled in each other's arms, and for the first time, it felt not like a temporary harbor, but like home. I slept deeper that night than I had in months, a profound, dreamless sleep, secure in the knowledge that when I woke up, he would still be there. And he was. The morning was not a landscape of avoidance. It was gentle and slow and easy. He was awake before me, just watching me, a soft, genuine smile on his face. "Morning," he whispered, as if we were in a sacred space, a place where loud noises were forbidden. He leaned in and kissed my forehead, a simple, tender gesture that spoke volumes. We made coffee together in his kitchen, our bodies brushing against each other in the small space with a new, comfortable familiarity. There was no awkwardness, no need to fill the silence with chatter. We just were. Together. We began to build a new life, a new us, out of the wreckage of our old assumptions. It was a slow and deliberate process of learning a new language, the language of an explicit, acknowledged love. We learned to talk, really talk, about our fears and our hopes. He learned to articulate the feelings that he had always tried to solve with action. I learned to voice my needs instead of quietly hoping he would intuit them. It was not always easy. We were two men who had spent our lives mastering the art of self-sufficiency, of quiet introspection. Learning to be vulnerable with each other was a daily practice, a conscious choice we had to make over and over again. My apartment, once my solitary sanctuary, slowly became our shared space. His things began to migrate over. A toothbrush in the holder, a stack of his books on my nightstand, his worn-out gray sweatshirt draped over my desk chair. Each new object was a quiet declaration, a brick in the foundation of the life we were building. The couch, once the stage for so much of our silent drama, became just a couch again, a place for watching movies, for cuddling without subtext, for simply being together. The bedroom door, which I had once seen as a symbol of our ambiguous boundary, was now something we closed together at the end of the day, shutting out the rest of the world and creating our own private, peaceful space. I remember one afternoon, a few months later. We were lying in bed on a lazy Saturday, the sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I was watching him as he read, his brow furrowed in concentration. The same intense focus he applied to his coding, he applied to his novels. I felt a wave of such profound love for him, so pure and so peaceful that it almost took my breath away. He must have felt me looking at him, because he lowered his book and met my gaze, a questioning look in his eyes. "What is it?" he asked softly. I just smiled. "Nothing," I said. "I'm just taking a picture." He didn't understand. Of course, not literally. I didn't have my camera. But in my mind, I was capturing the moment with perfect clarity. The quality of the light, the soft lines of his face, the feeling of his hand resting on my chest, the overwhelming sense of peace that filled the room. It was a photograph I knew I would keep forever, stored not on film or a memory card, but in the most secure and sacred archive of my heart. It was an image of us, finally, beautifully, in focus. We learn, I think, that a home is not always a place with four walls and a roof. Sometimes it is a person. It is the safe harbor of their arms, the steady rhythm of their breathing in the dark, the quiet understanding in their eyes. It is the place where you can finally put down the heavy armor you carry and just be. Julian and I had been circling each other's orbits for years, two solitary bodies drawn together by an invisible gravity we were too afraid to name. We had to get lost in the ambiguity, to fumble through the darkness, to crash and to burn, before we could find our way to the simple, profound truth that had been there all along. We had to learn that the quietest moments are often the ones that hold the most meaning, and that the most courageous thing you can ever do is to allow yourself to be truly seen by someone else. And in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned to create together, we began to heal, and we began to build our home.